Well, first off, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Kayla for organizing this. Thank you to Mayor-elect Allen for joining us. Already noted his interest and support in historic preservation and historic education here in Rutherford County, and I hope he continues and reinforces it. Kayla is running away, but she has a job to do. Come here. She asked the professor to give a talk, so naturally there are handouts. I was asked to talk about the American Revolution in Tennessee, and I couldn't help though notice that I'm giving this talk in the context of the 250th, and particularly something I'm sure a lot of you are interested in and watching, and that's Ken Burns' documentary, right, on the American Revolution. And since I am a college professor, I'm naturally going to argue with Burns a little bit in trying to explain the American Revolution in Tennessee. And argue with him in this sense, that when you watch that series and you read some of the historians that he has on there as talking heads, you probably notice a couple of things that frame their discussion of the American Revolution. Number one, he and his compatriots were looking for or trying to find one American Revolution, okay? A kind of a singular unitary event that would tie the country together. And second, also pay attention to the fact that this vision of the American Revolution is a rather short, compact American Revolution in terms of time, right? That he starts in roughly around 1763, right? And cuts off in the 1780s, right? And I'm going to take a little issue with both of those ways of looking at the American Revolution, particularly when you look at it here in Tennessee. And instead, note that the American Revolution was a diverse thing, a contested thing, right? What the revolution meant for the people who supported it in Tennessee wasn't what it meant in Massachusetts, right? Or in coastal South Carolina, or in the Caribbean, or in Canada. And second, the American Revolution in Tennessee was not a short event, okay? It was, I'll suggest to you, a much longer one, right? As people in this state who supported American independence worked to try and define what the American Revolution meant and push their vision of what an independent United States, an independent American Republic was going to be onto the region in which they lived and onto the entire country. And to do that, as you're reading there, I'm going to focus on two men who were important in early Tennessee, one of them being Colonel Arthur Campbell, and the other being one everyone's familiar with, John Sevier. But hopefully talk about them in a way in which is a little bit different, focus on a few different aspects of their lives than what a lot of histories of early Tennessee tend to focus on. First off, I would like to talk a little bit, as I said, maybe complicate how you look at the American Revolution. Okay? But first, here on the left, to think about and understand the American Revolution here, as I said, a contested event. First off, keep in mind, for instance, not every British colony in the Americas joined the independence movement. Okay? Canada, Bermuda, Florida, the colonies in the Caribbean, right, had their own issues, their own conflicts with the imperial authorities in London, but they chose, and their leaders chose, not to support the idea of being independent. Right? So it was just those 13 on the Atlantic seaboard. And second, even in those colonies, right, there were plenty of people who remained neutral or were loyalists, who did not see their own future, their own ideals, okay, in the American Revolution. And so they, in various ways, okay, some passive, some very aggressive, if you're talking about armed loyalists, chose to oppose the idea of American independence. But even deeper, if you talk about the American Revolution and American revolutionaries as that group of people in the colonies who supported the idea of American independence from Great Britain and the creation of an independent American republic, right, out of that chunk of the British Empire. Even those people, okay, had a lot of different visions of what this was going to mean, a lot of different ideas, why America should be independent, what an independent America was going to do. I know a lot of times students or people in the public, when they hear that, well, I'm the history department's sort of expert on early America and the American Revolution, that they ask me, well, what would the founding fathers have thought about this? Or what would the founding fathers have thought about that? And my usual response is, they would have argued about it a lot, right? It's what they spent most of their time doing, arguing with each other, right? And, one of the first problems, one of the first issues that they faced, in trying to create or unify a single people around the idea of an independent republic, is that they didn't have, at that time, any real definition or understanding of what an American was. Okay, they had been right up through 1775 British, okay, or even more specifically, thought of themselves as English in many cases. Right? They were subjects of the crown when they thought about a lot of the political things that we associate with the revolution: personal liberty, limited government, representative government. Above all, in the world at that time, those were English things. Okay, and many of them, took enormous pride in that. And then, they turned around and they looked at this sort of chunk of territory, this very big, diverse chunk of territory that they were trying to turn into a single country. And they saw just enormous diversity within it. It's one point I make to my students when talking about early American colonies, is that across the 16 and 1700s, right, the imperial government in London had used the American colonies for a variety of purposes: economic, political, military, and so on. But one of the big ones that they used it for was as a dumping ground for their own problems of diversity and internal conflict, right? If you had people who didn't like the established church, the Church of England, okay, you sent the Catholics to Maryland, you sent the Puritans to Massachusetts, you sent the Quakers to Pennsylvania and to East and West Jersey. Okay? If you didn't like slavery, but you liked the profits from it, you banned it in England, but you were quite supportive of it 3,000 miles away across the ocean. If you had a crime problem, okay, and you didn't want to pay for prisons or hang everybody, you sent them over to the colonies, okay, on indentures. That's why the British government in the 1780s founded New South Wales in Australia as a penal colony. Okay? Because it was the 1780s, and the American colonies had declared their independence and said, we don't want your convicts anymore. Okay, send them somewhere else. Deal with your problems another way. Okay? So right from the get-go, okay, these colonies trying to form a new nation had, just this enormous degree of internal diversity. Okay, different religions, races, ethnicities, economic functions, economic classes, right? And there wasn't really any sort of common understanding or identity of what an American was. And if they couldn't fully understand what an American was, well, then, what would this republic be? Right? The term republic, which was one of the few things that they all agreed on among the founding fathers. All right, we're going to form a republic. We're not going to bring in a new king. But that derived from the old Latin, res publica, of the things concerning the public. Well, what was the public? And what was the public in this very big, very diverse place? And so, practically here, right? And I'm not going to give a speech that's a paean to, diversity being wonderful, right? Practically, people understood, okay, not so much a diverse world, but they understood their own identities, their own rights, their own interests, their own communities at a much smaller, a much more local or regional, a much more particular level than what we would later think of as America or Americans. And the result of this, then, as I said, not only was the American Revolution contested, as different groups of people argued and struggled even within the new republic over what it was going to mean, the American Revolution was a long one. Okay, the issues and the debates and the conflicts started well before 1776, and they lasted well after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, long, long after. And the American Revolution in Tennessee is a good example of this. Okay. So, first off, I want to try and define who Tennessee's revolutionaries were. Right? And that's one thing to consider. First off, who were the supporters of American independence in the region of, well, the modern Tennessee that would later become the state. And again, keep in mind the limits of this. Obviously, one big group who lived in the region, Native Americans, okay, largely did not support American independence, although the Chickasaw, right, in West Tennessee chose generally to ally themselves with the Americans, again, for reasons of their own, not particularly because they were reading the pamphlets of Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, but rather particularly they wanted to side with the Americans to hold off the Choctaw from driving them off their lands. Okay? Largely the supporters of American independence in the Republic in Tennessee, they were European colonists. Largely, they were people who had come down, migrated down the Great Wagon Road through originally from Philadelphia, then down through Western Virginia into the backcountry of the southern states. Right? And they were too heavily Scots-Irish in their descent. And this is a question I need to ask you. Do you all know who the Scots-Irish were? Okay, I'm only getting one nodding head. It needs a little definition, particularly when you start talking about Arthur Campbell and talking about those Fincastle resolutions that you'll be taking a look at here in a moment. In their attempts to conquer and pacify Ireland, okay, going back into the 1500s, the English crown had confiscated lands from rebellious Irish chieftains and noblemen and turned them over to Protestant colonists. Okay? Not getting enough Protestant colonists from England to be willing to migrate to Ireland, they turned especially to Scotland. Right? Brought in large numbers of Scots to be tenant farmers on these confiscated lands. Right? Especially this group of people concentrated in what had been the most rebellious province of Ireland, the northern province of Ulster, roughly contiguous with modern Northern Ireland. Those people settled in Northern Ireland beginning in the late 1500s and in subsequent decades. And as they took root there, they came to be referred to as the Scots Irish. Okay. Now, by the 1700s, English government in Ireland was a good deal more established. Irish resistance had largely been crushed, and the English authorities felt a little more comfortable about dealing more sternly with some of their Scottish tenant farmers. And so, starting in the 1720s and 30s, English landlords began raising rents so they could increase their income. English religious authorities began more vigorously imposing the old Test Acts and various discriminatory laws against even Protestants who were not members of the Church of England. As a result, then, large numbers of these Scots Irish began to emigrate from Ulster. Right? And particularly many of them, thousands, tens of thousands, headed for the colonies in North America. And one of the most immediately attractive ones was Pennsylvania, okay, because of the old Quaker policy of complete religious toleration. From there, many of these people, they migrated out onto the western frontier of Pennsylvania, encountering opposition from the native tribes of the Ohio country. They especially turned south and began migrating and colonizing down the backcountry, Western Virginia, North South Carolina, down into Georgia on the eve of the American Revolution. So these Scots-Irish settlers played a big, big role in the American colonization of the southern frontier. It's why to this day, if we still had phone books, if you flipped through a phone book in a good southern town and you got to the Mick this and Mick that, it would be page after page. It's also why there are so many redheads running around the South, far out of their natural habitat, up in Scotland or Ireland or Scandinavia, where it's cloudy all the time and lacking a lot of melanin and burning the way I do, wouldn't be that big of a disadvantage. But that historical memory, okay, and the issues that the Scots-Irish faced would play a big, important role in what the American Revolution meant in Tennessee. Okay? And what it meant for a lot of these people. Okay? First off, that America and their migration to America meant an escape from feudalism. Okay? They had been brought to Ireland as tenant farmers, renting from wealthier English landlords, and they'd seen the vulnerability that left you with year by year. You could see the work that you had put into the land, the farms, the communities that you had built. It was never genuinely yours. Okay? And rents could steadily be raised. You remained under their thumb. And also an escape from religious persecution. The Scots-Irish, like most good Scots Protestants, they were Presbyterians. Okay? And as long as they were needed to fight the native Roman Catholic Irish, right, and maintain English imperial security, they were largely left alone. But once that battle had been won by the 1700s, uh, increasingly the fact that they were dissenters from the established Church of England became a problem. And they saw their political, legal, economic rights chipped away at a rapid rate. Okay? America then, for them, offered, first and foremost, a potential escape from that. Okay? In order to, what they might acquire then, though, okay, was personal freedom and political rights, especially by getting land. Okay, that's what independence meant back in the 1700s. Not at a big political level of states and nations, but at a personal level. Okay, independence meant that you weren't dependent on the will of someone wealthier or more powerful than you, and above all, the way that you could assert that, the way you could get that, was by owning land. Okay, owning farmland. Okay? That meant that you were your own man. Okay? That meant that you were the master of your household, the protector of your family. Okay? You didn't rely on somebody else. Nobody could kick you off. Okay? Nobody could bankrupt you. Right? Nobody could fire you. And through the political rights you then had, because again, in British North America, in order to vote, you had to be a freeholder, a landowner. Okay? You could defend your community and defend your interests. Now, of course, the place you had to get this land was on the western frontier, which meant that these people who were migrating out into what would become Tennessee, they had opponents, they had enemies. Native Americans, obviously. Okay? They were moving into their traditional hunting grounds and their holdings. They were impinging on the economies that tribes like the Cherokee and the Creek and the Chickasaw and the Shawnee had built, hunting deerskin and other animals and trading it to European merchants in exchange for manufactured and consumer goods. And because those native peoples, those native hunters were dealing with those European merchants, in many cases, European powers themselves, okay, were the opponents of this expansion. Okay? Scots-Irish farmers running off into the woods, building log cabins, growing Indian corn and distilling it into whiskey a lot of the time, was not a big money maker from the perspective of the Board of Trade in London. Okay? Native hunters and the fur trade, that was a moneymaker. And so, oddly enough, for these men moving into Tennessee with their families, the British government was in colonial governments on the East Coast were suspicious of what they were doing. Not sure whether this is going to pay off. Not sure that the empire or its individual colonies should be throwing their resources behind this movement. Okay? So Tennessee's revolutionaries, okay, understand their particular vision, their background, their ambitions, okay, their conflicts, their enemies. Okay? And you can start to shape then what they thought America should be, what they believe the American Revolution should be in the American Republic, and understand then too why it was then a long struggle. Okay? And I would say in the end, a successful one, right, for Tennessee's revolutionaries to get the American Republic to be and do what they wanted it to be. Okay? Now, as I said, I'm going to focus on two men here, okay, talking about their long American Revolution. The first is a man named Arthur Campbell, Colonel Arthur Campbell. He is mainly remembered by anyone who is a junkie for Tennessee history as the man who called, convened, and chaired the first meeting sort of delegates, of representatives of the different counties and communities across the southwestern frontier that met at Jonesboro in 1784. That was the first step in the founding of the insurgent state of Franklin, okay? Or as Campbell himself put it, Frank Land. Right? And that's his main recollection, right, of what Arthur Campbell meant to the Tennessee frontier, right, and to revolutionary Tennessee, is his involvement in the Franklin movement. But I would suggest one of the ways to think about Campbell and understand the man is, in fact, realizing that his American Revolution started a long time before that. Particularly, I'd point to one of the first points being 1758. Campbell was Scots-Irish. That Campbell name is a dead giveaway, obviously. He had, like many of the others, migrated, his parents and then he himself migrated down the Great Wagon Road into southwestern Virginia. And in 1758, in fact, he was only 14 years old. He was serving with a company of Virginia Rangers on the western frontier, trying to defend the frontier against potential attacks from Native Americans and the French after, well, George Washington had bungled things at Fort Necessity and General Braddock had bungled the Fort Duquesne campaign. But while serving it, Campbell's unit was attacked by Wyandot Indians, and Campbell himself was taken prisoner. And he was marched back to a region around Fort Detroit, the French fort there, where he was tortured. Right? And he was kept as a slave of sorts by the Wyandot for a couple of years as a teenager until he managed to escape. Right? Trekked through the wilderness of the Ohio country for 2 weeks before he found a British military unit, right, who rescued him, and then he spent the remainder of the 7 Years' War until 1763 serving in the far west as a scout. Right? Campbell, that experience, okay, was really a formative one. He was already involved, even as a teenager, in this war to expand British American settlement into the far southwestern frontier. And his experience in that war cemented in his own mind a hatred of, one, Native Americans, and two, the European powers that he saw working behind them. Immediately, initially, it was the French, right? That this war with Native Americans, in his own conception, was a war between not so much whites and Indians, okay, but a war between the British and the French, okay? Particularly, as you'll read here in a second, a war between Protestant Britain and Catholic France. His loyalty, though, to Britain was sorely tested in the years after the end of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War concluded with a comprehensive victory for the British. Right? The French in the peace treaty were forced to cede all of their land holdings in North America, all of French Canada, all of the Ohio Valley to Britain. And for men like Arthur Campbell and other settlers on what would become the Tennessee frontier, in their view, they had won. Okay, this was the victory. right? Now the path west for them to meet all of their ambitions, okay, was now open. However, in the years immediately after, the British government in London seemed steadily to betray the interests of colonists, betray the interests of young men like Arthur Campbell, who had suffered, fought, struggled to help win this great victory. If you remember your US history, one of the first things the government did, the British government, was draw up the Proclamation Line of 1763, drew a line over the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and forbade colonial settlement west of it. Right off the bat, the British government sided with the Native Americans of the Trans-Appalachian West and the European merchants who traded with them against settlers. And this policy continued. The British government took Indian diplomacy away from the colonists and handed it over to Indian agents, right, appointed by London. In 1774, and this is an odd little note, but it's an important one when I make you start reading your handout here in a second. Parliament passed a piece of legislation called the Quebec Act, which organized what had been French Canada as a British province. And it included a whole bunch of concessions to French Canadians and their Native American allies. It made Roman Catholicism the established religion of Quebec. It established French law as standard in Quebec. It also expanded the borders of Quebec all the way south to the Ohio River at the expense of the land purchases and ambitions of a lot of wealthier Virginians. Okay. That sense of betrayal, okay, that the British government was not giving this movement of colonists onto the southern frontier what they had wanted, prompted Campbell to support American independence. Particularly, that took the form of his involvement in the drafting of what are called the Fincastle resolutions, which you've got there on your handout on the front page, some selections from that document. The Fincastle resolutions were produced by the sort of leading resistance committee in Fincastle County, Virginia, which was the county that pretty much encompassed the entire southwestern frontier, all of southwestern Virginia, Kentucky, and so on. Resolutions that other counties had sent to the Virginia government advocating continued resistance, armed resistance to Britain. And the Fincastle resolutions are interesting here because, number one, they were one of the most aggressive in terms of supporting their early in 1775 armed, violent American resistance to British imperial rule. But also they really hammered home on issues of concern to people in southwestern Virginia and now what would become Upper East Tennessee. And if you look at it, the things that are in bold and all caps are things that I pulled out to emphasize. Campbell was on that committee, as I said, and he played a large role in drafting these things. Notice right off the bat, repeated references to George III as a Protestant prince. Okay? Campbell and the other men on the Fincastle committee continued to conceive of the struggle, right, and their own vision of personal liberty as one that was a struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism. This was something, remember, that so many of them had learned all the way back, or their ancestors had learned all the way back in Ireland. Okay, that was the old fight of the Scots-Irish. Okay? Notice too in there, okay, the number of things, well, right off the bat, if you go down to the middle of the page, where Campbell and his fellow committeemen wrote, many of us and our forefathers left our native land. Okay? For many of them, Ulster and Ireland, considering it as a kingdom subjected to inordinate power and greatly abridged of its liberties. We crossed the Atlantic, and then this then uncultivated wilderness, bordering on many nations, as he put it, of savages. And note in several places talked about the military struggle, okay, as their claim to the resources of Virginia and the grounds for their resistance to British rule. Okay? And especially, okay, I'd say, these fatigues and dangers we patiently encountered, supported by the pleasing hope of enjoying those rights and liberties, okay, that had been granted to Virginians, granted, as he pointed out in a number of other places, property, okay, property, and the transmitting of them inviolate to our posterity. So Campbell's American Revolution here, if you read the Fincastle Resolutions as an expression of his own views and those of his compatriots, it was a very local struggle. Okay? They had come to America to acquire property, acquire religious freedom, acquire political rights, and, if necessary, fight Native Americans and European empires in order to do so. And Campbell then and his fellows looked at the revolution as a continuation of that long old struggle, okay? Indeed, against Roman Catholic monarchy, against Native Americans, right? Or even maybe the Native Irish. Right? And they hoped then that if they couldn't get the support, they couldn't get a British Empire that in fact supported how they viewed the American Revolution, then perhaps the American Republic, an independent American Republic, would be the government that would give them what they wanted. I'll say, though, that one experience that many Tennesseans quickly had after the American Revolution was that just as Arthur Campbell and others had been disappointed by the British government after 1763, a lot of Westerners were disappointed by the American government after 1783. The government, in many cases, stepped into sort of that old role that the British had held after 1763, that the French had held before, negotiating peace with Native Americans, making concessions in the interests of the Indian trade, right? Or in the interests of simply keeping the peace for a new, impoverished, militarily rather weak country. Right? And so in many cases, Tennesseans, their response to the American Revolution and the success of it was some degree of dissatisfaction. That was one of the big things that fed into the Franklin movement. We are not getting what we want out of Virginia, out of North Carolina. Perhaps if we are an independent state, we will then have the negotiating power at the national level to see that our interests are followed through. Okay? And certainly that was Arthur Campbell's view of things. But note here, this struggle for him and his definitions of it went way back. His American Revolution was a very long thing. The second man I'm going to focus on is one I imagine most all of you are very familiar with, the great hero of early Tennessee, John Sevier. But, I mean, Sevier is, of course, best known uh, among Tennesseans and Tennessee historians for it being a military commander, okay, of militia units. First, during the Indian Wars of the 1770s, he was Nolichucky Jack. And then he was also the man who led uh, Tennessee militias, the Over Mountain Men, back into North Carolina to fight against the British. And he took part in the victory that American forces won at the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1779, which played such a big role in defeating Cornwallis's invasion of the South, an attempt to sort of reconquer the South. After that, though, you look at most severe biographies and treatments, and they sort of peter out after Kings Mountain. Instead of talking about that early period, I want to talk about the end of Severe's life, the last few years, okay? And make the point that, first off, the man did not go down quietly in his old age. Okay? If anything, he was more politically aggressive and ambitious in his last years. Okay? But that particularly in the last few years of his life, John Sevier was still fighting the American Revolution. He didn't see it even in 1811, 12, 1815. He didn't see it as complete. He didn't see it as having been won. Okay? I include this portrait of him. It's actually not too many copies of it available or pictures of it. It hangs actually in the Belmead Country Club. I include it because it's an interesting one. It's one of the only ones that is available for the end of Severe's life. Most all the portraits you see of Sevier are from the 18th century when big powdered wigs were still fashionable for men, and you see Sevier with that wig. That had gone out of style by the 18 teens, and men instead wore their hair much shorter and wore it with the high collar. You see here Sevier in his mid to late 60s as a man of several decades after the start of the American Revolution. Thing I'd note about Sevier at the end of his life, okay, is that he was, even as an old man, okay, one of the most aggressive and prominent war hawks, okay, supporters of, spokesmen for the United States dealing with its ongoing grievances with Great Britain by going to war. Okay? Pride of place is usually given, when you read the history books, when talking about the war hawks, to guys like Henry Clay and Felix Grundy here in Tennessee, or especially, of course, the guy who had appeared upon the scene by this point, Andrew Jackson. But if anything, Sevier, even as an old man, remained much more aggressive and much more important here. He, in 1809, he had served several terms as governor of Tennessee, and he got term limited out under the Constitution. And so he sat for a moment, but then immediately turned for the first time really in his life and pursued national political office. Okay. He had through most of his career remained simply within Tennessee state politics. But in 1811, he ran for and won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, right? And went off for one of the first times in his life to Washington, D.C. to serve in the national government. And it was very clear when he got there that he was very much a man on a mission. In fact, I think it was a journalist who noted the famous old frontier fighters' appearance in D.C. And said, Sevier was stiff and grim as an Indian arrow, not speaking but looking daggers. And, well, immediately it became clear that really his sole purpose in getting to D.C. was to push the American government into war with Britain and to see that that war was properly, aggressively carried out. But at the same time, of course, again, his own vision of what this war meant. Okay? First off, normally you read U.S. history textbooks about the War of 1812, it tends to focus on grievances about, British impressment of American seamen or interference in American shipping. All of that stuff is written by historians from Boston, right? That or New York. That's their War of 1812. Tennessee's War of 1812, that was something different. Okay? Tennesseans like Sevier, in the younger generation, they looked at the southwestern frontier and they saw an incomplete conquest. They saw Native Americans still armed, potentially resisting with violence. They saw the British government, the Spanish government, continuing to provide support, arms, trade, encouragement, right, to them. Anybody figure out? I'm getting there. Sevier himself, when he wrote to his son about this war. As if you flip the page, you've got some quotes from Sevier about it. Right? And he wrote, "We shall have to cope again with the old Tory party." And it seemed from his actions, that he included in that, not just the British, okay? It was still the old struggle that was continuing, right? As he put it then here later, we may look for hot times, for the British are inevitably strong. I fear stronger than at the beginning of the revolution, which he apparently felt was still not over, was still being fought. But he also included potentially among those Tories Americans who were less than enthusiastic about the idea of going to war with Britain. Okay? There were still sort of internal opponents to Sevier and other Tennesseans' vision of what the American Revolution was supposed to mean, what the American Republic was supposed to do. Sevier's vision, right, was the same as Andrew Jackson's and others in Tennessee. The War of 1812 was not so much about, battles on the high seas and merchant seamen and things like that. No, it was about the Trans-Appalachian West. Right? That the conquest, the colonization that they hoped to achieve hadn't been achieved. Right? That imperial powers were continuing to try and thwart American expansion, and they were continuing to use Native Americans, right, as a tool to accomplish this. During the War of 1812, right, when Sevier finally succeeded in getting the Madison administration to commit to war, Sevier immediately got himself onto the most important House committee he could find, right? The House Committee on Military Affairs, in charge of financing and administering the whole military effort. He wanted to make sure that national resources were committed to this struggle in the largest and most efficient way that he could. A lot of sources claim that he, in fact, got himself into the chair position of that committee, although that's not entirely backed up by full documentary evidence. But certainly he got himself, right, as a rather new congressman onto a big, important committee, right, and played a major role in it. And when the war was over, he promptly got himself a commission from James Madison, the president, to lead the American Survey Party to survey the new boundaries of the Creek Nation after Jackson had forced a treaty on the Creek, in which they had been required to cede a large amount of their territory in Alabama. And that's, in fact, when he was down surveying the Creek boundary in 1815 as a 70-year-old man tromping through the woods that he sickened and passed away. I mean, he was buried near Fort Decatur. But you could see in his late life, right, in his sort of final burst of political, right, aggressive, ambitious political action, that he shared a vision of what the struggle of the American Revolution meant, right, common to a lot of Tennesseans. And that's where I'd point you to that last quote there on the back, that paragraph. It dates roughly from 1820-ish. Okay? It's a letter from an unnamed old Tennessee pioneer to a man who was the first serious historian of Tennessee, a guy named John Haywood, who wrote, published in 1823, Civil and Political History of the state of Tennessee through 1796. And this old pioneer wrote to Haywood this letter in which he explained his own views of the events that had occurred and the wars on the frontier and the settlement of Tennessee. In fact, I used the guy's original language. He was of sketchy literacy, as you can see. Haywood, in fact, in the history, if you read it, you can find this passage. Haywood cleaned up the spelling and the grammar, and he put it straight into the history. Okay, not as a quote, but as this is how it was. Right? Haywood himself endorsed this as the official version of what the struggle on the Western frontier had meant. And you see, the old pioneer argued that the wars on the frontier had been the essence of the American Revolution, right? That Native Americans had gone to war with the American Republic because they had been stirred up, encouraged by European powers, like Britain, right, and Spain, and that in fact those powers had done this. They had pushed Native Americans into their attacks on settlers and the wars that they fought because those European monarchies were trying to, in one way or another, destroy the American Republic. Okay? The American Revolution for this man, and for John Haywood, the state's first real historian, and for John Sevier, who is still conceiving of it in this way, still fighting the American Revolution in 1815. Right? That's what the American Revolution meant to Tennesseans. That's how they defined it, and that's how they asserted, and I'd say rather successfully in the end, that that's what America ought to be, right? That their fight, their struggle was intimately tied, indeed, right there in the very heart of what it meant to be an American and what the American Revolution, right, really should be understood as. And so you're left then, I'd say, if you want to think about the American Revolution in Tennessee, understand it as a local revolution, for starters, and a long revolution. Okay? Arthur Campbell was fighting the American Revolution as a 14-year-old in 1758, right? And he carried the ideas, right, that he had from his background and his experiences forward into his actions. John Sevier, okay, was still fighting the American Revolution as a 70-year-old man, right, in 1815, working to commit the United States fully and finally to the conquest of the Western frontier in the greater Mississippi Valley. So understand Tennessee's American Revolution as a contest, not just a contest with European powers, with the contest with the Cherokee or the Creek, but also a contest with other Americans to define what the revolution would be, and that it was a long American Revolution. It had deep roots, and it continued on well after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Thank you.
So welcome, friends and neighbors. Kayla asked me to do this, and I'm Randy Allen, and I am very honored to be the mayor-elect of Rutherford County. I'm honored to join you today in celebrating the premiere of the America 250 lecture series and the revolutionary Rutherford traveling exhibit. This exhibit reminds us that Rutherford County's story is woven into a larger story of our nation. From ordinary citizens who shaped our early days to the communities that carried that legacy forward. As I step into my new role as Rutherford County Mayor, I'm committed to preserving our local history, supporting civic leaders, civic learning, and ensuring these stories remain accessible to every resident. You said, hey, you knew that I was interested in history, that I am a graduate of MTSU. I have a minor in history. I appreciate history very much. And as a matter of fact, I look at everything through the lens of history. So I like to know how we got to where we are. It helps make decisions as we move forward. I encourage families, students, and history lovers to attend the lectures, explore the exhibit, and take pride in the people and places that make Rutherford County unique. Thank you to Kayla for the invitation. And thank you to the Rutherford County Library System, the Historical Research Center, MTSU, and all sponsors for making this celebration possible. Let's honor our past as we work together toward a stronger future. Thank you.